When you look at a modern city skyline, what do you actually see? You see the glass, the steel, the shiny new developments just reaching up into the clouds.
Right, the stuff that looks good on a postcard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we naturally judge the health of a city by what is visible right now today. Like, if the skyline is growing, we just assume everything is fundamentally sound.
Yeah, and that skyline is essentially our current economy. I mean, it's the immediate reality we interact with every single day, right? The jobs, the stock market, the housing prices in our neighborhood.
But if a skyscraper suddenly starts leaning, or, if one specific neighborhood floods every single time it rains, while the adjacent one stays perfectly dry, you don't just stare at the top floor to figure out why.
No, you'd be looking in the wrong place entirely.
Right. You have to go down into the dark, you have to pull up the floorboards, get into the basement, and really look at the foundation.
Right.
You have to ask, who poured this concrete?
Right.
And what materials were they actually allowed to use?
That's a great analogy because the foundation dictates literally every single thing that comes after it. You just cannot understand the structural integrity of the present without, digging into the historical blueprints of the past.
Yeah, and that is exactly what we're doing today for you, our listener. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We know you're here because you want a thorough, BS-free synthesis of some really complex topics without feeling totally overwhelmed.
And today's topic is definitely a big one.
It is. Today we are looking at the foundational blueprints of the racial wealth gap through the lens of excerpts from a very highly debated text, which is called The Price of Inequality and the Debt of Reparations.
And our mission here is really to unpack what economists call the black tax, trace the origins of these modern wealth disparities, and just break down the actual structural arguments for and against black reparations as they are presented in this text.
Right. And before we get into the weeds, I do need to make a very critical disclaimer right up front.
Yeah, we definitely need to lay the ground rules here.
Exactly. This source material touches on highly politically charged themes. We want to clearly inform you that we are not taking any sides today, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of the text.
Right. Our role here is strictly to act as impartial guides. We're just faithfully conveying and breaking down the arguments, the statistics, and the perspectives exactly as they are presented in the original source material.
Period. We're just looking at the math and the history. So, going back to that skyline analogy, to understand the modern economic landscape, the source suggests we have to look at how the foundation was built.
Yeah, because before we can even begin to debate solutions like reparations, we first have to define that invisible everyday cost the text describes, which is the black tax.
Right, so let's define that, because when I first heard black tax, I thought, wait, is this an actual tax?
I mean, no, it's not collected by the IRS. You won't see it on your W-2. According to the source, it's basically the cumulative economic, social, and emotional cost of surviving in a society that was built on racial inequality.
So it's like a continuous generational levy. Can we give some specific examples? Because the text gives some that hit your wallet right now, today, which I found super interesting.
Yeah, so we are talking about things like higher insurance premiums for the same demographics, just depending on your zip code, or lower home appraisals for identical properties simply because of the race of the homeowner.
Wow, just the appraisal itself.
Right, and it encompasses denied mortgages despite having the exact same credit score as a white applicant. Plus, workplace discrimination and, the sheer financial burden of supporting extended family members who were denied past wealth-building opportunities.
That family support aspect is huge. It honestly makes me think of, running a marathon, but the rules are fundamentally different depending on who's running.
How do you mean?
Well, imagine trying to run a grueling 26 miles, right? But one runner has to stop and pay a physical toll at every single mile marker.
Oh, man. Yeah.
It isn't just the coins they drop in the bucket. It's the exhaustion of losing your momentum. You have to keep starting and stopping while the other runners are just, effortlessly hitting their stride.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. It's not just the money, it's the time and the energy. And if we take that marathon analogy and trace it back to its absolute origin point in the text, we're talking about slavery.
Right.
From 1619 to 1865. I mean, this was an era of massive, unparalleled wealth generation, but completely without compensation for the people doing the work.
Just stolen labor.
Yeah.
And the text gets very specific about what that labor actually produced.
Yeah, we're talking about the crops, cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar, indigo, but also the physical infrastructure. Building roads, railroads, government buildings. It wasn't just agricultural.
And there's a staggering statistic from the text that just stopped me in my tracks.
The one about the financial assets.
Yes. that by 1860, enslaved people represented one of the largest financial assets in the entire U.S. They were literally worth more than all American railroads and factories combined.
Yeah, it's almost hard to wrap your head around that scale. And cotton was the nation's largest export by far.
So this massive wealth transfer basically created the booming American economy. And that leads to a crucial historical pivot, which is emancipation.
Right, the end of the Civil War.
But here is the question that the source poses, and it's a huge one. What happens when freedom is granted, but capital is completely withheld?
Well, that's exactly what sets up the machinery of the wealth gap. It was freedom, but with zero capital. And there was this huge broken promise right at the start.
You're talking about the 40 acres thing.
Yeah, General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15. This was an order that actually confiscated coastal land for formerly enslaved families.
So they were going to get real assets.
Right, but it was almost immediately reversed under President Andrew Johnson, and that land was returned to its former Confederate owners.
Wow. And the distinction between income and assets is just critical here, right? Like the text makes a huge point about this. Income pays today's bills, but assets create tomorrow's wealth.
Exactly. Income is your paycheck, but assets like land or a home, they compound. They build equity over generations.
But let me push back for a second, or at least ask a question that I think a lot of people might have. Because a lot of people might think, well, the wealth gap was just bad luck after the Civil War. Like it just took time to catch up. How does the source show that the government actively prevented asset accumulation for Black families while helping others?
It's a great question, and the text points to three very specific policy mechanisms where the government intervened. The first is the Homestead Act of 1862.
Okay, what did that do?
The federal government essentially gave away millions of acres of land to white settlers out west. But recently, emancipated Black Americans had practically no access to this.
So they were giving away the board on the monopoly game, basically, but only to certain players.
Precisely. And then, jumping to the 1930s, you have redlining.
Which was about housing, right?
Yes. The federal government created lending maps and literally labeled Black neighborhoods as hazardous.
Literally drew red lines around them.
Right. So mortgages in those areas were denied. Meanwhile, white families were able to buy appreciating homes in other areas, which became the primary source of intergenerational wealth in America.
Man, that's incredibly stark. And the third policy was the GI Bill, right? Which, I mean, on paper, that was supposed to be race neutral.
On paper, yes. It provided amazing benefits like home loans and college tuition for World War II veterans. But the catch was that it was administered locally in highly discriminatory ways.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so local banks and universities essentially locked Black veterans out of those home loans and college spots, completely neutralizing the benefits.
So because wealth compounds over generations, being locked out of these 19th and 20th century programs isn't just like ancient history.
Not at all.
It's a mathematical reality that directly created today's massive wealth disparity, which I think leads perfectly into the modern reparations debate.
It really does, because when you look at the current math, it's pretty undeniable. According to the Survey of Consumer Finances cited in the text, white per capita wealth is roughly 6 times Black per capita wealth.
6 times?
Yes, and that disparity has persisted for over 160 years.
Wow. So that brings us to the actual arguments for reparations in the text.
Yeah.
And they frame it very specifically, not as charity, right?
Right. The pro-reparations perspective views it strictly as the repayment of a documented debt.
Like balancing a ledger.
Exactly. And they point out that there are real historical precedents for this. The government has compensated groups for state-sanctioned harm before.
Like who?
For example, survivors of the Japanese-American internment camps or the victims of the Rosewood Massacre. So the legal and moral framework already exists.
Okay, but let's go through the arguments against reparations, because the text lists a few major pushbacks, and I want to hear how the advocates respond to them.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, pushback number 1. No one alive today owned slaves. I hear that one all the time.
And the advocates' response is that this isn't about personal guilt. It's about institutional liability. The government is a continuous entity, and it's about addressing obligations from government actions that persist across generations.
Okay, that makes sense. Pushback number 2. It's impossible to determine who actually gets the money after all this time.
The response there is that proposals actually focus on very specific documentation. Just like past reparations programs, it would focus on descendants of the enslaved or documented victims of policies like redlining.
So it's forensic accounting, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. And pushback number 3, the country just can't afford it because we're talking about a lot of money.
Right. But advocates argue that this is about repairing a centuries-long structural wealth gap that's actually holding the whole economy back. It's not just funding a short-term social program, it's settling a structural default.
This brings up an emotional core from the text that I found really fascinating. It's this psychological point about inconsistency.
Oh, the framing of public investments.
Yes. When we look back at public investments that historically benefited white Americans, like those land grants or the housing subsidies, we celebrate them. We call it nation building.
Right. The American dream at work.
Exactly. But when proposals come up to repair documented racial harms using similar government mechanisms, they are so often dismissed as divisive or like a handout.
Yeah, that inconsistency is so crucial. And whether one agrees with reparations or not, understanding that deep sense of historical inconsistency is really the only way to understand how the black tax is felt by families today.
Because it's not just history. It's happening right now. So how does this modern black tax actually manifest today, according to the source?
Well, it shows up in lower inherited wealth, for one, and because of that lack of family financial safety nets, it leads directly to higher student debt.
Right, because grandma didn't have a house to borrow against to help pay for college.
Exactly. It also leads to greater exposure to predatory lending, reduced home equity because of that historical redlining we talked about, and honestly, just the sheer emotional labor.
The emotional labor.
Yeah, the daily toll of navigating systemic bias in healthcare, the justice system, and education, it's exhausting.
It goes right back to that marathon runner, paying a toll at every mile.
It does. And synthesizing the final conclusion of the source document, it's interesting because historians and economists actually broadly agree now.
They agree on the history.
Yes. They agree that these disparities exist and that government policies played a massive role in creating them. The actual core of the disagreement in America today isn't really about whether the history happened.
What is it about them?
It's entirely about what obligations, if any, that history creates for the present. That is the absolute crux of the debate.
Wow. You know, for you listening, I think understanding these specific policies like redlining or the Homestead Act, it really gives you a totally new lens to view the invisible architecture of the modern economy.
It completely shifts your perspective.
It does. It changes the conversation from these abstract feelings of unfairness to concrete, compounded historical ledgers.
And to wrap up, I want to leave the listener with a philosophical question to mull over, one that builds on the source's mention of time and emotional energy.
I love these. Lay it on us.
We talk a lot about how financial wealth compounds over time, right?
Right.
But what about the compounding cost of lost human potential? If generations of people have had to spend a significant percentage of their daily energy simply navigating structural barriers and bias.
Just trying to survive.
Exactly. What world-changing innovations, what new businesses, or what incredible works of art are missing from our society today simply because all that brilliant energy had to be spent on surviving.
Man, that is a heavy but incredibly necessary thought to take with you. It's not just a loss of money, it's a loss of human brilliance.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone listening. Keep looking closely at the foundation.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.